The plane sat at the gate, its engines humming softly as passengers filed aboard. It was one of those flights where everything seemed designed to make you feel important. Wide seats, soft lighting, and attendants who smiled just enough to seem genuine. First class was nearly full, but there was still an air of calm that separated it from the chaos of economy behind the curtain. Lisa Dawson stepped through the narrow aisle, her heels clicking lightly against the carpeted floor. She moved with purpose, carrying herself like someone who had spent years commanding rooms much larger than this one. Her dark skin glowed under the warm cabin lights, and her short natural hair framed a face that radiated both confidence and kindness. She wore a tailored navy blue suit paired with gold accessories that caught the light every time she turned her head. In one hand, she held a leather portfolio filled with documents for an upcoming meeting. In the other, a slim laptop case. She found her seat by the window, a prime spot, and slid into it gracefully. A flight attendant approached almost immediately, offering her a glass of sparkling water or perhaps a mimosa before takeoff. Lisa declined politely, opting instead to settle in and review her notes. As she opened her portfolio, the man across from her cleared his throat loudly, drawing her attention. Jake Carter leaned back in his seat, arms crossed over his chest, looking every bit the stereotypical cocky pilot. He wore aviator sunglasses, pushed up onto his forehead even though they were indoors, and a leather jacket that screamed, "I'm cooler than you." His sandy blonde hair was styled carelessly, as if he hadn't bothered brushing it after rolling out of bed. There was something about him, maybe the smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, that set Lisa on edge right away. "Nice setup," Jake said, nodding toward her portfolio. His voice carried just enough sarcasm to be noticeable. "You some kind of model? Actress? You look like you could be famous." Lisa paused, her fingers resting on the edge of a document. She glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. "No," she replied simply, her tone measured. "I run a company." Jake raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Oh yeah? What kind of company does someone like you run?" The emphasis on "someone like you" wasn't lost on Lisa. She'd heard remarks like this before, from colleagues, investors, even strangers at networking events. People often underestimated her because of her race or gender, assuming she couldn't possibly belong in spaces dominated by men. But usually, those assumptions came wrapped in subtlety, hidden behind polite smiles or carefully worded questions. Not this guy. This guy wore his prejudice like a badge of honor. "I work in technology," Lisa said, keeping her voice steady. "We develop software solutions for businesses." Jake chuckled, shaking his head as if she'd told a joke. "Software, huh? That's impressive. Must be nice to have people around who actually understand all the technical stuff while you, I don't know, keep things running smoothly?" Lisa blinked slowly, choosing her words carefully. "Actually, I lead the team that designs and implements those solutions. So yes, I do understand the technical side quite well." For a moment, Jake looked taken aback, as if he hadn't expected her to push back. Then his smirk returned, wider this time. "Well, good for you. Guess times are changing, huh? Still, seems like a tough field for, well, someone like you to break into." Lisa felt a flicker of anger, but she pushed it down. She'd dealt with worse comments in boardrooms and conference halls. This wasn't new territory for her. Instead of responding immediately, she closed her portfolio and fixed him with a level gaze. "Let me ask you something," she said. "Do you think your opinion of me would change if I told you my company generates millions in revenue annually?" Jake shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Maybe. Or maybe I'd just assume you got lucky." The comment stung, though Lisa didn't let it show. She leaned forward slightly, her posture relaxed but deliberate. "Luck doesn't build successful companies." "Mr. Carter," he supplied, smirking again. "Jake Carter." "Mr. Carter," Lisa continued, her voice firm now. "Success comes from hard work, strategy, and innovation. Maybe you should try focusing less on what people look like and more on what they accomplish." Jake opened his mouth to retort, but the sound of engines revving drowned him out. The plane began moving, inching forward as it prepared to taxi down the runway. Passengers buckled their seatbelts and adjusted their trays, the hum of conversation fading into silence. For a few minutes, neither Lisa nor Jake spoke. She turned her attention to the window, watching as the ground slipped away beneath them. Outside, clouds stretched endlessly across the horizon, their shapes shifting in the late afternoon sun. But inside the cabin, tension lingered. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier bravado faltering slightly. He glanced around, noticing for the first time how several nearby passengers were avoiding eye contact with him. Daniel Hayes, a retired military officer sitting 2 rows ahead, gave him a disapproving look before returning to his book. Emily Ross, a young journalist typing furiously on her laptop, paused briefly to glance in their direction, her brow furrowed. Lisa, meanwhile, remained unfazed. She had dealt with entitled men like Jake her entire life, men who thought they knew better simply because of their gender or background. They weren't worth losing sleep over. Still, part of her wondered whether he'd learned anything from their exchange. Probably not, she decided. People like him rarely did. As the plane climbed higher, breaking through layers of cloud, Lisa allowed herself a small smile. She didn't need validation from someone like Jake Carter. Her achievements spoke for themselves. And if he wanted to keep making assumptions about her based on appearances, that was his problem, not hers. Unbeknownst to either of them, the real drama was only beginning. The plane soared higher, climbing steadily above the clouds. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, creating a steady rhythm that seemed to underscore the tension between Lisa Dawson and Jake Carter. They hadn't spoken since takeoff, but the silence between them was anything but peaceful. Every so often, Jake would glance at Lisa, as if trying to figure out how to regain control of the conversation he'd clearly lost. But Lisa didn't give him the satisfaction of acknowledging his stares. She focused instead on reviewing documents from her portfolio, occasionally jotting down notes in the margins. Jake, however, wasn't done. He shifted in his seat, leaning forward slightly. "So," he began, his tone dripping with false casualness, "you really think you're some kind of big shot, huh?" Lisa looked up briefly, her expression unreadable. "I don't think I'm a big shot," she replied calmly. "My work speaks for itself." Jake smirked, shaking his head. Sure, work ethic and all that, but let's be real. How many people like you actually make it to the top in tech? Not exactly a level playing field, is it?" Lisa felt her patience, wearing thin, but she kept her voice even. "What do you mean by people like me?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "You know what I mean," Jake said, waving a hand dismissively. "Women, minorities, people who don't fit the usual mold. It's not easy breaking into fields dominated by, well, people like me." Lisa raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by his attempt to reframe his prejudice as insight. "And yet here I am," she said simply, "running a successful company. Maybe it's time you reconsider your assumptions about what people are capable of." Jake laughed, but there was an edge to it now, a hint of discomfort masked by bravado. "Okay, fair enough. You've got your little empire. Good for you. But let's not pretend it's because you're some genius. There are probably a dozen guys working under you who handle the real brainwork." Before Lisa could respond, Emily Ross, the journalist seated nearby, spoke up unexpectedly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. "Did you just imply that women can't lead in tech because they're not smart enough?" Jake turned toward her, startled. For a moment he seemed unsure of how to react. Then his smirk returned, though it lacked its earlier confidence. "I didn't say that," he replied defensively. "I just think experience matters, and let's face it, most leaders in tech have been doing this for decades. Decades." Emily leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Funny thing about decades, they tend to exclude anyone who wasn't allowed in the room back then. Ever heard of systemic bias?" Jake rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed. "Here we go again. Everyone's so obsessed with being politically correct these days. Back in my day, we judged people based on merit, not identity politics." Lisa couldn't help but laugh softly at that. "Your day?" she echoed, raising an eyebrow. You're what, 35, 36? Hardly old enough to reminisce about the good old days? Jake bristled at her comment, his face flushing slightly. Look, lady, I'm just saying things used to be simpler. Now everyone's walking on eggshells, afraid to tell the truth. The truth? Lisa repeated, her tone suddenly sharper. The truth is that people like you use phrases like back in my day to justify shutting others out. The truth is that women and minorities have always been capable, we just haven't always been given the chance. For a moment, no one spoke. Nearby passengers had stopped pretending not to listen, their attention fully on the escalating exchange. Daniel Hayes, the retired military officer, cleared his throat loudly, drawing everyone's gaze. Ma'am, he said, addressing Lisa directly, if you need backup, I've got your 6. Lisa smiled gratefully at him. Thank you, but I'm fine. Some people just aren't worth the energy. Jake scowled, sinking deeper into his seat. He muttered something under his breath, too low for anyone to hear clearly, but Emily caught the gist of it. Care to repeat that? She challenged, holding up her phone. Because I'm recording this conversation. That stopped him cold. Jake stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. You're recording me? He sputtered. That's invasion of privacy. Nope, Emily said breezily. Public space, public speech. Besides, stories like yours deserve to be told. Jake looked around the cabin, searching for support, but found none. The other passengers avoided meeting his gaze, some shaking their heads in disapproval. Even the flight attendants seemed to move a little faster near his seat, as if eager to distance themselves from the drama unfolding there. Lisa took advantage of the lull to refocus on her work. She pulled out her laptop and began typing, ignoring Jake entirely. It wasn't long before he tried to provoke her again, this time targeting her choice of reading material. What's that? He asked, nodding toward her screen. Another PowerPoint presentation, or are you finally diving into something challenging? Lisa glanced at him coolly. It's a proposal for a new project, she said. But I doubt you'd understand it. It's quite technical. Technical? Jake scoffed. Please. If it's anything like the rest of your operation, it's probably all surface-level stuff. Fluff designed to impress investors who don't know any better. This time, Lisa didn't bother hiding her frustration. You know what's funny? She said, closing her laptop with a decisive click. People like you always assume ignorance when they don't recognize intelligence. Maybe instead of making baseless accusations, you should try learning something for a change. Jake opened his mouth to argue, but before he could get a word out, turbulence hit. The plane jolted violently, sending drinks spilling and tray tables rattling. Passengers gasped, grabbing onto armrests or seatbacks as the aircraft shuddered through rough air. Lisa remained perfectly still, her years of travel teaching her to stay calm during such moments. Jake, on the other hand, gripped his seat tightly, his knuckles turning white. When the turbulence subsided moments later, the cabin erupted into nervous laughter. Jake loosened his grip, exhaling sharply. See? He said, attempting to sound smug despite his obvious relief. This is why pilots need real skill, not whatever nonsense you're peddling. Lisa fixed him with a piercing stare. Actually, she said, her voice cutting through the lingering chatter, I happen to know several pilots personally, including the captain of this flight. Jake froze, his bravado crumbling. You're bluffing, he muttered, though uncertainty crept into his tone. Try me, Lisa replied, reaching for her phone. With a few quick taps, she sent a text message to Marcus Reed, a close friend and senior pilot with the airline. She didn't elaborate on the details. She didn't need to. Marcus would understand immediately. As the flight continued smoothly onward, Jake grew increasingly agitated. He fidgeted in his seat, glancing toward the front of the plane every few minutes. Whatever confidence he'd started with was gone now, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Little did he know, his worst fears were about to become reality. Unseen by Jake, Emily finished editing the video clip she'd recorded earlier. She uploaded it to her cloud storage, adding captions and timestamps for context. By the time the plane landed, the footage would be ready to share with her editor and, potentially, the world. For someone like Jake Carter, the consequences of his words were only beginning to unfold. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew heavier. Jake Carter couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control of the situation. Every time he tried to regain his footing, Lisa Dawson's calm demeanor and sharp words cut through his attempts like a knife slicing through butter. His arrogance had turned into something closer to panic, though he did his best to hide it behind forced smiles and awkward jokes. Lisa, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed. She leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms as she watched him squirm. Her earlier frustration had given way to a kind of detached amusement, like observing a child throw a tantrum while knowing they'd eventually tire themselves out. But she wasn't about to let him off the hook just yet. "So," Lisa said, breaking the silence, "tell me this. If experience and skill are so important, why do you think people like you keep getting caught making such basic mistakes?" Jake blinked, caught off guard by her question. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice sharper than intended. Lisa tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "Well, take your comments earlier. You assumed I didn't understand my own business because of how I look. That tells me one of two things. Either you're not very observant or you don't actually care what the truth is. You just wanted to sound clever." "I wasn't trying to sound clever," Jake snapped, his face reddening. "I was pointing out reality." "Reality?" Emily interjected, looking up from her laptop. "The only thing you've pointed out is your own bias, and honestly, it's embarrassing." Jake shot her a glare, but quickly looked away when he noticed several passengers nodding in agreement. Even Daniel Hayes, who had been quietly reading a book until now, lowered it to give Jake another disapproving stare. It was clear that the tide had turned against him, and there was no lifeline in sight. Desperate to change the subject, Jake latched onto the one area where he felt confident: flying. "Look, maybe I don't know much about tech companies or whatever you do," he said, leaning forward again, "but I guarantee you wouldn't last 5 minutes in my world. Aviation is different. It requires real expertise. Not everyone can handle." Lisa raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. "Oh, really? Tell me more. What makes aviation so special?" Jake grinned, finally finding solid ground beneath his feet. Or so he thought. "For starters, pilots have to make split-second decisions under pressure. We deal with life-and-death situations every day. Can your little software company say the same?" Lisa nodded slowly, considering his point. "That's true. Pilots do have incredibly demanding jobs. But here's the thing. Even the best pilots rely on systems designed by engineers and programmers. Without technology, planes wouldn't fly at all." Jake waved a hand dismissively. "Yeah, sure, computers help. But at the end of the day, it's the pilot who keeps everything together. Machines can't think for themselves." Emily chimed in again, her tone teasing. "Actually, Jake, artificial intelligence is advancing faster than most people realize. In fact, some airlines are already testing autonomous flights. Maybe your expertise won't be needed much longer." Jake's grin faltered, replaced by a scowl. "Autonomous flights? That's ridiculous. No one trusts robots to fly planes. Passengers want real humans in charge." "Do they?" Lisa countered gently. "Or do they trust the systems and processes that ensure safety? After all, autopilot handles most of the flight these days anyway. Humans step in only during emergencies." Jake opened his mouth to argue but hesitated, realizing she had a point. Still, admitting defeat wasn't an option. Instead, he doubled down. "Fine, maybe machines play a role. But someone still has to program those machines, and trust me, women and minorities rarely succeed in fields like coding. It's just facts." This statement sent a ripple of murmurs through the cabin. Several passengers exchanged incredulous looks, while others shook their heads in disbelief. Even the flight attendant passing by slowed her steps, shooting Jake a glare before moving on. Emily set her laptop aside and leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Let's talk about those facts, shall we? Because the data says otherwise." Women and minorities make significant contributions to STEM fields, including aviation software development. The problem isn't lack of talent, it's barriers created by attitudes like yours. Jake flushed, stammering as he tried to defend himself. I didn't mean it like that. I'm just saying, it's harder for them, okay? They face challenges guys like me never have to deal with. And whose fault is that? Lisa asked softly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Who creates those challenges? Who perpetuates the idea that certain groups aren't capable? People like you, Jake. Whether you realize it or not, your words matter. They reinforce stereotypes and discourage others from pursuing their dreams. For a moment, Jake sat frozen, unable to respond. His bravado had crumbled entirely, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. He glanced around the cabin searching for allies, but found none. Everyone avoided his gaze, their expressions ranging from pity to outright disdain. Finally, he mumbled something unintelligible and slumped back into his seat, defeated. Lisa allowed herself a small, satisfied smile before turning her attention back to her work. She reopened her laptop, typing steadily as if nothing unusual had happened. Meanwhile, Emily resumed editing her video clip, adding captions and timestamps for context. She knew the footage would spark conversations far beyond this plane, conversations about prejudice, accountability, and systemic change. For someone like Jake Carter, the consequences of his actions were only beginning to unfold. Unbeknownst to Jake, Lisa's text message to Marcus Reed had already reached its destination. Within minutes, Marcus had reviewed the details and decided to take immediate action. As the plane cruised toward its destination, preparations were underway to address Jake's behavior upon landing. In the meantime, the rest of the flight passed in relative peace. Passengers returned to their books, laptops, and conversations, though occasional glances toward Jake hinted at lingering disapproval. Lisa, however, remained focused and composed, embodying the grace and resilience that defined her character. By the time the captain announced their descent into New York City, Jake looked pale and jittery, his earlier confidence replaced by anxiety. He buckled his seatbelt tightly, gripping the armrests as if bracing for impact, not from turbulence but from whatever awaited him on the ground. As the plane descended through the clouds, Lisa gazed out the window, watching the city skyline emerge from the haze. She felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing she'd stood up for herself and inspired others to do the same. Whatever happened next, she was ready. The wheels touched down with a gentle thud, signaling the end of the flight, and the beginning of Jake's reckoning. The plane taxied slowly toward the gate, its engines winding down as passengers began gathering their belongings. The mood in the first-class cabin was tense but subdued, especially around Jake Carter. He sat rigidly in his seat, his knuckles white as he clutched the armrests. His earlier arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Every announcement from the flight crew seemed to echo louder in his ears, each word feeling like a countdown to something he couldn't escape. Lisa Dawson, on the other hand, appeared perfectly relaxed. She methodically packed her laptop and portfolio into her bag, her movements deliberate and unhurried. If she felt any lingering frustration or anger toward Jake, it didn't show. Instead, she radiated an air of calm confidence, as though she already knew how this story would end, and she was satisfied with the outcome. As the seatbelt sign turned off, a flight attendant approached Jake with a polite but firm smile. "Mr. Carter," she said, "the captain has requested to speak with you privately before disembarking." Jake's stomach dropped. He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "What? Why?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm just following instructions," the attendant replied coolly. Her tone left no room for argument. Jake glanced around nervously, noticing that several passengers were watching him with thinly veiled curiosity. Lisa met his gaze briefly, her expression unreadable, before returning to organizing her things. Emily Ross, the journalist, gave him a pointed look and smirked slightly, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Even Daniel Hayes, the retired military, Officer raised an eyebrow as if to say, "You brought this on yourself." Reluctantly, Jake unbuckled his seatbelt and followed the flight attendant to the front of the plane. His heart pounded in his chest as they passed through the curtain separating first class from the cockpit area. When they reached the door marked "Crew Only," the attendant knocked lightly and stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. Inside, Captain Marcus Reed stood waiting, his arms crossed over his chest. Marcus was a tall, imposing figure with salt and pepper hair and a commanding presence. He wore his uniform with pride, every detail perfectly pressed and polished. His dark eyes locked onto Jake immediately, assessing him with a mixture of disappointment and authority. "Mr. Carter," Marcus began, his voice steady and measured, "do you know why I asked to see you?" Jake swallowed hard, shaking his head. "No, sir, I don't understand what's going on." Marcus sighed, leaning back against the counter. "Multiple passengers have reported your behavior during the flight. Specifically, your disrespectful comments toward Ms. Dawson and others. As an employee of this airline, such conduct is unacceptable." Jake's face flushed bright red. Wait. Reported? What are you talking about? I didn't do anything wrong." Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off. "Let me be clear, your remarks were not only inappropriate but also discriminatory. This violates our company's code of conduct, which applies to all employees, even those traveling as passengers." But, Jake sputtered, struggling to find words. "It was just a conversation. People are blowing this out of proportion." "Is he?" "That's so," Marcus countered, pulling out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then held it up for Jake to see. It was a video clip, Emily's footage, showing Jake making his condescending comments about women and minorities in tech. The audio was crystal clear, capturing every sneer and dismissive remark. Jake's jaw dropped as he watched the playback. That's not fair," he protested weakly. "She recorded me without my permission." "That doesn't matter," Marcus replied firmly. "This is a public space, and your actions reflect directly on the airline. We cannot tolerate behavior that alienates our passengers or damages our reputation." Jake ran a hand through his hair, panic rising in his chest. "Okay, fine. Maybe I said some things I shouldn't have, but firing me, isn't that a bit extreme?" "It's not just about what you said," Marcus explained. "It's about who we are as a company. We value diversity, inclusion, and respect for everyone. Your behavior goes against everything we stand for." Jake slumped into a nearby chair, defeat written all over his face. He opened his mouth to argue further but realized there was no point. The evidence was damning, and Marcus's tone made it clear that the decision had already been made. "Effective immediately," Marcus continued. "You are terminated from your position with this airline. Ground control has been notified and your credentials will be revoked pending further investigation. You'll need to collect your personal items and leave the aircraft quietly once we dock." For a long moment, Jake sat in stunned silence. His career, the one thing he'd prided himself on, was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Finally, he muttered a quiet, "I understand," and stood up shakily. Back in the cabin, passengers were beginning to disembark. Lisa was among the first to rise, collecting her belongings and stepping into the aisle. As she passed Jake, who now stood near the exit looking pale and shaken, she paused briefly. Their eyes met, and she offered him a small, knowing smile, not one of triumph but of quiet resolve. "You'll learn from this," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough warmth to soften the blow. "I hope you use it to grow." Jake nodded, mutely, unable to respond. He stepped aside to let her pass, his shoulders hunched in defeat. Behind him, Emily snapped a final photo of his dejected figure before joining the line to exit the plane. Outside the terminal, reporters waited eagerly, alerted by Emily's article, which had gone live moments after landing. Headlines like, "Airline. Pilot fired mid-flight for discriminatory remarks" dominated social media feeds, sparking outrage and discussion across platforms. Passengers from the flight shared their own accounts, amplifying the story's reach. For Jake, The consequences extended far beyond losing his job. He was now a public example of unchecked prejudice and entitlement. Meanwhile, Lisa walked confidently through the airport, her head held high. She checked her phone and saw dozens of notifications pouring in, from colleagues praising her poise, friends cheering her on, and even strangers thanking her for standing up against discrimination. One message in particular caught her eye. It was from Marcus. "Thanks for reaching out. Let's grab dinner soon and celebrate progress." Lisa smiled to herself, tucking her phone back into her bag. Despite the drama of the past few hours, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Not because she'd won some battle, but because she'd stayed true to her values and inspired others to do the same. As she stepped into the bustling streets of New York City, the weight of Jake's insults faded into the background. Ahead of her lay new opportunities, fresh challenges, and the chance to keep pushing boundaries in a world that still had much to learn. And Lisa Dawson was ready for all of it. Months had passed since the infamous flight, but its impact lingered far beyond the confines of the airplane cabin. For Lisa Dawson, life had only grown busier. Her company continued to thrive, securing new contracts and expanding into global markets. But more importantly, she had become a symbol of resilience, a living testament to the power of standing up against prejudice and staying true to oneself. Invitations poured in from conferences and organizations eager to hear her story, and Lisa embraced the opportunity to share her experiences with wider audiences. One such invitation came from a prestigious technology summit held in San Francisco. The event brought together leaders, innovators, and thinkers from across the industry to discuss the future of tech and the challenges facing those who sought to shape it. Lisa was scheduled as one of the keynote speakers, tasked with delivering a speech titled Resilience and Accountability in Leadership. As she prepared backstage, adjusting her suit and reviewing her notes, she couldn't help but reflect on how much her journey had changed her perspective, not just professionally, but personally. When her name was announced, the crowd erupted into applause. Lisa stepped onto the stage, greeted by warm smiles and enthusiastic cheers. She took her place at the podium, pausing briefly to soak in the energy of the room. On the large screen behind her, the title of her speech appeared, accompanied by a photo of her smiling confidently during a recent business meeting. It was a stark contrast to the tense moments aboard that flight months earlier. "Good morning," Lisa began, her voice clear and steady. "Thank you all for having me here today. I want to start by acknowledging something we don't talk about enough, the weight of being underestimated." The audience leaned forward slightly, captivated by her opening line. Lisa scanned the room, making eye contact with individuals scattered throughout. She could see nods of agreement, especially from women and minorities seated near the front. "I'm sure many of you have been in situations where someone doubted your abilities based on factors completely unrelated to your skills or qualifications. Maybe it was because of your gender, your race, your age, or simply because you didn't fit the mold they expected. For me, one of these moments happened not too long ago, on a flight from New York City." She paused, letting the anticipation build. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd as people pieced together what she might be referring to. Some chuckled knowingly, others sat up straighter, eager to hear the full story. "On that flight," Lisa continued, "I encountered a man who made assumptions about me based solely on my appearance. He dismissed my achievements, questioned my competence, and even suggested that people like me rarely succeed in fields like mine. At first, I felt anger at his ignorance, at the audacity of his remarks. But then I realized something important. His words revealed more about him than they ever could about me." The audience nodded approvingly, some clapping softly in support. Lisa smiled faintly before continuing. "That day I chose to respond with facts, not emotion. I reminded him that success isn't defined by stereotypes but by hard work, innovation, and determination. And when he doubled down on his biases, I let his actions speak louder than his words. Because sometimes, accountability isn't about confrontation. It's about exposing the truth and letting consequences follow naturally." Lisa clicked a button on her remote, bringing up a slide showing headlines from the viral news coverage of the incident. Quotes like, "pilot fired after," racist remarks, and "standing up against discrimination in tech" flashed across the screen. The audience murmured again, this time with a mix of surprise and admiration. What happened next wasn't just about me or him, Lisa explained. It sparked a broader conversation about bias, privilege, and the responsibility we all share to create inclusive environments. People started sharing their own stories of being overlooked, dismissed, or judged unfairly. And that's when I realized the real lesson. Our voices matter. When we stand up for ourselves, we inspire others to do the same. She paused once more, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the room. Then she transitioned to the second part of her speech, focusing on actionable steps for fostering accountability and inclusion in leadership roles. One of the biggest challenges we face is systemic bias, Lisa said, gesturing toward the screen, which now displayed statistics about diversity gaps in tech and aviation industries. These numbers aren't accidents. They're reflections of cultures that prioritize certain voices over others. But change starts with awareness. We must actively seek out diverse perspectives, amplify underrepresented voices, and hold ourselves accountable when we fall short. She shared examples from her own career, highlighting initiatives her company had implemented to promote inclusivity. From mentorship programs for young women entering STEM fields to partnerships with organizations advocating for minority representation, Lisa demonstrated how small actions could lead to meaningful progress. As she wrapped up her speech, Lisa returned to the theme of resilience. Being underestimated can feel like a burden, she admitted, but it can also be a gift. It forces us to dig deeper, to prove not just to others, but to ourselves that we belong. And when we rise above those doubts, we show the world what's possible. Her final slide read simply, "Progress requires courage." The audience erupted into applause, rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Lisa bowed her head humbly, her heart swelling with gratitude. This moment wasn't just about recognition, it was about connection. She had shared her truth, and, in doing so, she had inspired countless others to embrace theirs. Backstage after the speech, Lisa was greeted by a line of attendees eager to thank her. Among them was Emily Ross, the journalist who had recorded Jake Carter's comments on the flight. Emily hugged Lisa warmly, saying, "You've made such an impact. Thank you for being brave enough to share your story." Lisa smiled, squeezing her hand. "Thank you for helping bring attention to it. None of this would have happened without people like you willing to listen and act." Later that evening, Lisa met up with Marcus Reed and Daniel Hayes for dinner at a nearby restaurant. Over plates of pasta and glasses of wine, they laughed and reminisced about the events of that fateful flight. Marcus raised his glass in a toast. "To resilience," he said, his eyes twinkling, "and to holding people accountable, for better or worse." They clinked glasses, savoring the camaraderie. As the night wound down, Lisa reflected on how far she'd come since that turbulent journey. While the memory of Jake Carter's remarks still lingered, it no longer carried the sting it once did. Instead, it served as a reminder of her strength and the collective power of standing together against injustice. For Jake, however, the aftermath had been far less forgiving. Stripped of his job and credibility, he struggled to rebuild his life. Offers for new positions were scarce, and when they did come, they came with strings attached: mandatory sensitivity training, public apologies, and probationary periods. Eventually, he found work at a small regional carrier, flying routes few others wanted. But the lessons he learned weren't easy ones, and the scars of his past mistakes followed him wherever he went. In contrast, Lisa's future seemed limitless. Her courage had opened doors she hadn't imagined, connecting her with allies and opportunities that fueled her mission to drive change. As she left the restaurant that night, walking under the starlit sky, she felt a profound sense of hope. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but she knew she wasn't walking it alone. Together, step by step, progress would continue to unfold, and Lisa Dawson was ready to lead the way. Months after the viral incident and Lisa Dawson's inspiring speech at the Technology Summit, life had settled into a new rhythm, but not without its lasting impacts. For Lisa, the flight that began with tension and prejudice had transformed into a turning point, both personally and professionally. Her courage in standing up against discrimination had resonated deeply with people around the world, sparking conversations about bias, accountability, and inclusion in industries long dominated by outdated norms. One crisp autumn morning, Lisa found herself boarding yet another flight, this time bound for Chicago to attend a leadership conference. As she stepped onto the plane, the familiar hum of engines and the scent of polished leather greeted her. First class was as luxurious as ever, but this time there was no lingering anxiety or unease. Instead, Lisa felt a quiet confidence, knowing she belonged exactly where she was. The flight attendant welcomed her warmly, offering a glass of sparkling water before takeoff. Lisa accepted it with a smile and settled into her seat by the window. Moments later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and reassuring. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Ava Monroe speaking. We're expecting clear skies ahead and we'll be reaching cruising altitude shortly. Thank you for flying with us today." Lisa paused, recognizing the name immediately. Ava Monroe was one of the rising stars in aviation, a young black woman who had recently been promoted to captain after years of dedication and hard work. Lisa remembered meeting Ava briefly at an industry event months earlier and being impressed by her determination and poise. It seemed fitting that fate would bring them together again under such positive circumstances. As the plane climbed higher, Ava appeared from the cockpit, stepping into the first-class cabin to greet passengers personally. When she reached Lisa's row, her eyes lit up with recognition. "Ms. Dawson," she exclaimed, extending her hand. "What a pleasure to see you again." "The pleasure is mine, Captain Monroe," Lisa replied, shaking her hand firmly. "Congratulations on your promotion. You've earned every bit of it." Ava beamed, clearly touched by the compliment. "Thank you. It means a lot coming from someone like you. Your story inspired so many of us, including me, to keep pushing forward, no matter the obstacles." Lisa nodded thoughtfully. "Stories have power. They remind us that progress is possible, even when the path feels uncertain." For a few minutes, the two women chatted about their respective careers, sharing insights and experiences. Ava spoke candidly about the challenges she'd faced as a minority in aviation, from subtle biases during training to outright skepticism from colleagues. But she also emphasized the importance of allies, people like Lisa, who use their platforms to advocate for change. "It's because of leaders like you that doors are opening wider for women and minorities in fields like ours," Ava said earnestly. "When I heard what happened on that flight months ago, I couldn't help but feel proud, not just of how you handled yourself, but of the ripple effect it created. People started asking questions, challenging assumptions, and demanding better." Lisa listened intently, appreciating Ava's perspective. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she replied, "but every conversation matters. Every voice adds to the chorus calling for equality and respect. And seeing someone like you in the cockpit reminds me why this fight is worth it." Their conversation was interrupted by a gentle reminder from the co-pilot that Ava needed to return to the cockpit. Before leaving, Ava turned back to Lisa with a grateful smile. "Thank you for everything. Keep doing what you're doing. We need more role models like you." As Ava disappeared behind the cockpit door, Lisa leaned back in her seat, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey from that fateful flight to this moment had been transformative, not just for her, but for countless others who saw themselves reflected in her story. She glanced out the window, watching as sunlight danced across the endless expanse of clouds below. The sky stretched endlessly ahead, a symbol of possibility and promise. In the months following the incident, Jake Carter's fall from grace had served as a cautionary tale. Stripped of his position and credibility, he struggled to rebuild his reputation. Offers for new jobs were rare, and when they did come, they came with strict conditions: mandatory diversity training, public apologies, and close supervision. Eventually, he landed a job at a small regional carrier, flying routes far removed from the glamour of international travel. His arrogance had given way to humility, or at least the appearance of it, as he worked tirelessly to prove he could change. But for Lisa, Jake's downfall wasn't the focus of her reflections. What mattered most was the impact of the broader conversation his actions had sparked. Companies across industries began reevaluating their policies, implementing measures to address systemic bias and promote inclusivity. Conferences dedicated to diversity in tech and aviation drew record attendance, with leaders committing to actionable steps for meaningful change. Social media buzzed with hashtags like "Stand up for respect and progress through courage," amplifying voices that had long been silenced. Back home in New York City, Lisa continued to build bridges between communities, leveraging her influence to create opportunities for underrepresented groups. She partnered with organizations focused on STEM education for girls and minorities, funding scholarships and mentorship programs designed to inspire the next generation of innovators. Her company launched initiatives aimed at diversifying its workforce, ensuring that talent, not stereotypes, drove hiring decisions. One evening, as Lisa stood on the balcony of her apartment overlooking the city skyline, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The lights of Manhattan twinkled like stars, each one representing a dream, a goal, a story waiting to unfold. She thought about the young women and men who looked up to her, not as a hero but as proof that barriers could be broken and ceilings shattered. She thought about Ava Monroe, soaring through the skies with confidence and purpose. And she thought about the countless others whose names she might never know, but whose lives had been touched by the ripple effects of standing firm in the face of injustice. The phone buzzed softly in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Reed. "Just heard about another promotion for Ava. Looks like your influence keeps spreading." Lisa smiled, typing a quick reply. "It's not my influence, it's hers. People like Ava are the future." As she set the phone down, Lisa felt a renewed sense of hope. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she knew she wasn't walking it alone. Together, step by step, progress would continue to unfold, not just for her, but for everyone who dared to dream beyond limits imposed by prejudice and fear. And with that, Lisa turned back to the glittering cityscape, ready to embrace whatever challenges and triumphs lay ahead. The horizon stretched endlessly before her, full of promise and potential. Whatever storms might arise, she was prepared to navigate them, with resilience, grace, and unwavering determination. Because the sky was no longer a boundary, it was a beginning.